Today we dive in a little bit more about DHop's information we got so far. We're doing a little bit of this or that live, get each other's opinion on some player. Welcome to The Climb. Alex, welcome back. How are you doing today?
Doing good. It's a little toasty around here. I'm sure it's the same for you down in St. Louis. But
yeah, I legitimately walked out of work today and it's 7:00, so it's about at its peak. And I thought, and I'm like, yep, it's here. It's summer, even though it's about 2 months early. But
yeah, hey, it's a perfect day to sit inside and talk football.
I couldn't agree more. And we got a lot of fun stuff today. So a lot of people could give their opinions on it too. So if you guys do want to go ahead and give us your takes, we'd be happy to hear them and argue with us. We're good for a good conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we get into our this or that player comparisons here, we were going to talk a little bit more about the DeAndre Hopkins stuff. We touched on it a little bit in our Best Ball 15 video over the weekend. So definitely worth a watch if you haven't seen that yet. But obviously that's a little bit of an abbreviated format. So wanted to get a little bit deeper and kind of talk through where we think things are headed here with DHop. So pull this up. This is from 4for4. It's the ADP change over the last week, and I've got it limited to basically free agents and the Cardinals players. So a couple things that kind of stood out to me right off the bat. DHop has gone up in price by about 5 picks or half a round. So he's getting pretty close to that 3-4 turn at this point. Also interesting, basically all of the Cardinals wide receivers have gone up in price, with Rondale having the biggest jump, but Kyler has fallen almost an entire round since the DHop cut happened. And I'm kind of having a hard time making sense of that. Like if we don't think Kyler's playing, or if we think that the Cardinals are tanking, why are we pushing up these other guys?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And I have a couple puppies that are finally finishing up. And I mean, I'm late, like 16th, 17th round. And I think I saw Kyler sitting in one or two of them. And it didn't make sense to me. Like, I don't know how that's even possible. He's just such a high upside player. And especially at such a low draft cost right now. I mean, I'm going to take flyers on him. If I got pieces of Philly to tie him in with like that, if you could get a high scoring game between Philly and Arizona pretty easily, I feel like. So,
yeah. And on some of those receivers, like I get it, Marquise Brown, he's got the clear path to be the one. Rondale is the one that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. He's been a low ADOT guy, like extremely low ADOT guy his whole career. Maybe that changes with Shane Steichen coming in there, but he's the one right now out of all the Cardinals that I think I'm probably going to be least likely to click.
And I kind of touched on it in the Best Ball in 15 a little bit, not a whole lot, but I said I was going to start clicking Rondale more, as ironic as that is to say, solely for the fact that I do like a lot of the Eagles players. And I mean, if you're getting A.J. Brown early, if you get that, the Jalen Hurts, Devontae Smith stack at the turn, he's a good guy you can throw in at the end of your draft for low risk, with potential balancing. But like you said, I really don't see Rondale being a guy who puts up more than 15 a week, and he can just kind of be that wide receiver 3 or a low end flex.
And I think even as you start to look at the later round picks, the Flyers, there's still enough questions on all of them that we can't confidently say who's going to be starting in 2 wide receiver sets or 3 wide receiver sets. Like I personally am more willing to take a flyer on rookie Michael Wilson, just because I think he could end up being in the 2 wide receiver sets, but I've seen pushback on that. And even some people make the case that it's Zach Pascal. So between the uncertainties there and the fact that we think this is going to be a pretty gross offense for a lot of the season, I think I'm kind of leaning towards shying away here, unless, like you said, you are looking for an Eagles bring back towards the end of your draft.
And we even saw Greg Dortch flash a couple times last year. So it really is a toss-up on who this wide receiver 2 is going to be. I really only see myself going Rondale a little bit more frequently if we're at the point where all the other wide receivers are gross and it's simply for that game stack.
Yeah.
It does surprise. Now, I understand DHop rising in ADP. I initially said that he was going to fall because of uncertainty, but the teams that they're primarily looking at to be the favorites to take him, they have the huge upside. And I mean, it makes sense to have him go up with that, but some of them, we'll touch on it here a little bit more, I'm sure, in the this or that section. But with the betting odds, I'm not fully sure if he's going to be the one in a lot of these offenses. So he might be kind of that high draft cost depending on where he lands. And I don't know if I like him at that spot.
Yeah. I mean, I've tried to think through it. Like, let's say he does go to the Chiefs. Like, where do you think his ADP is?
He's got,
I mean,
I don't want to say first round because I don't think it's there.
I mean, mid-second, I think, isn't out of the question. No, and Mahomes is tricky because he's not getting past the Jamar Chase drafter in most cases just because of week 17. But, like, I could see a world where you can start drafts with Kelsey and then turn around and get DHop in the second round.
No, definitely. And I think that's the whole issue with it is if he goes to KC, he's still the 2. If he goes to the Bills, he's still the 2. Like, those are the 2 most appealing teams. Even if he goes to somewhere like the Jets, in my eyes, he's still the 2. So we're always looking at the second target in the offense. So we're looking at him as, if you're looking at like Devontae Smith or T. Higgins, how you view those guys personally, it would be in the same category for DHop for me.
I think that's fair. I don't know, in some ways, the Chiefs landing spot is a little bit more appealing to me on the surface, just because we have seen Kelsey and Tyreek both put up monster seasons together. Mm-hmm. But I mean, the Bills have such a high pass rate that, I think he and Diggs could both have good seasons. It's just a question of cost, like you said. But thinking through those landing spots and the fact that we do expect him to go up quite a bit, like I am happy to take him in drafts right now. We're kind of talking offline, but not really doing a lot of drafts at the moment, aside from, some Best Ball Mania for Underdog Cardio Club, just because we are kind of in this dead zone where there's not a lot of actionable news. But in the drafts I am doing right now, I like taking DHop late in the third, just on the bet of, okay, if he goes to one of these teams, he's going to shoot up, and definitely would rather pick him at late third than mid-second. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I do think, when we know where he lands, obviously the ADP is going to go real quick, or it's going to drop pretty quickly too. Because imagine if he does go somewhere gross like New England. Where does he fall then? He probably the Mike Evans range. Once again, that's 65. I kind of use him as a borderline of where I'm like, this is probably about the last group of people where I'm going to start to dislike him and start dropping off at least. So he's going to be right on that fringe of good versus bad.
Yeah, he's definitely got a wide range of outcomes right now for his ADP. So, depending on where you are in terms of like the range of outcomes, what you think is most likely, he's a guy you can exploit in drafts right now, one way or the other. So
he's an interesting piece. So I don't know. We'll talk about him here more in a second, but let's go ahead and get into this or that.
All right. So for this, we're going to be comparing 2 players. We each picked out 3 pairs for the other person to kind of break down. So just to kind of set the stage here, when we're looking at these 2 players, obviously most of the time when we're drafting, we're thinking through things like correlation, stacking, roster construction, all of that. We're kind of taking that out of the picture in this case, assuming that both players fit our team build, that there is no tiebreakers in terms of correlation. We're just purely getting down to the nitty-gritty. Which player do we like more at their current cost, assuming that it's for Best Ball Mania? So, kind of mentally factoring in that this contest is going to be open for another 3 months. So with that, I'll turn over the floor to you, EJ, here for our first one. We've got Jordan Love versus Russell Wilson.
Okay, so this is going to shock you to a certain extent, but I'll get into my Jordan Love spiel, and then I'll go into Mr. Unlimited over here. So this is Jordan Love's 4th year in the league. He's only played 1 full game, and that was in 2021, so not that long ago. He threw for 190 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, and he ran for 23 rushing yards. They also did not win that game. So back when he was getting drafted, apparently he was getting his NFL play style is very similar to Blake Bortles, which that also I was like, I don't even remember him well enough to know what his play style is. And apparently back in 2020, this was a more recent article that I read. I think it was the beginning of the May when this article was wrote. And I can't remember, and I'm blanking on it. But they were viewing him potentially as a Patrick Mahomes style, since Patrick Mahomes sat out his first year and then he became a star. Now, Jordan Love had 2 years on the bench, and then he played that game, and he didn't perform, whether that was nerves or just trying to still fully adjust to the NFL. That's still yet to be determined, obviously. So last year, Aaron Rodgers ran this offense, and he didn't run it very successfully in my eyes. Whether that was Aaron Rodgers being fed up with the Packers, or he was just simply gave up and ready to move on to whatever his next dream was at that time, because that changes monthly. I do think that the Packers are going to start running the ball quite a bit more. I think Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon are going to be key pieces in this offense. Christian Watson obviously has star potential. He's showed it. He had big flashes last year. As far as the rest of the receiving core, we're fairly uncertain on who the 2 is and what they're even going to be doing as an offense as a whole. So I do have a lot of reserved concerns about Jordan Love in that matter. However, there is the upside, and he's been with the offense for a long time. And sometimes the unknown is what we're excited about. I've drafted a fair amount of Jordan Love because I've drafted a lot of TJ Hawkinson, which correlates with that game stack. So I guess I'm more in on Jordan Love than what I expected. With Russell Wilson, I went back and looked at his fantasy numbers over his career. 7 out of 11 seasons, he was a quarterback 1. He was the number 1 overall quarterback in 2017. He has 2 seasons at quarterback 13, so he was just outside of the fringe there. He was quarterback 18, which is where his current ADP is as quarterback last year. So we're drafting him as last year's finish. It was his first season in the new offense. We got Sean Payton there. I would actually probably compare Russell Wilson to be very similar to Drew Brees at this stage in his career. So I'm kind of liking where Russ is sitting in that number. And we look at Russ's last 4 games. He was the QB3, QB22, but he got injured in that game, only played 75% of snaps. QB5, QB2. So towards the end of the year, Russ really turned it on. And I believe he is, like I said, he was 18. I think Jordan Love is QB 21 right now. And you're looking at about 17 spots in overall ADP. So currently, I'm betting on Sean Payton fixing Russ, getting him back to that form. And the man had his first change in offensive scheme, and a full offensive scheme, since he was a rookie. So I firmly believe he just didn't have that full adaptation that he was wanting to have. And, Nathaniel Hackett didn't do whatever he was trying to do. And I just think Sean Payton is the kind of guy that can play better to Russ's style. And I think we're going to see a lot of growth out of Russ this year. So I'm going all in on Russ. I'm going to be taking him in a lot of 2 QB drafts now, I have a feeling. And I feel firm. Like if I went to a Russ, like those 2 guys, I'm locked in as my 2 QBs for that. So there's my feeling. I'm all in on Russ going forward.
All right. Yeah, this is a tricky one for me because obviously first off, difference in price between this year and last year. Last year, Russ was an 8th or 9th round pick. He's going top 100. And I was pretty heavily overweight on all the Broncos last year. So, it's hard for me to disassociate with how badly I got burned by Russ.
Yes.
But I guess a couple things that stand out to me with him. One thing with Denver as a whole, I don't lean too much into trying to predict what defenses do, except for on the extremes. Mm-hmm. And I think Denver's defense showed last year that they can be extremely good. You mentioned late in the season, it was week 14 against the Chiefs and week 16 against the Rams that Russ and some of the Denver pieces had really big games. By that point in the year, the defense had pretty well checked out.
That's fair.
Earlier in the season, they were top notch. So that is one thing that gives me some pause. But like you said, at his current cost for what you're getting, when you are making that bet on Russ, you can do 2 QB builds with them.
I would also just give the fact that we know Russ. I think there's way more upside with Jordan Love because of the unknown. But we know what you're getting with Russ, and I just think that Russ has that little bit more consistency, and he still has upside. It's just Jordan Love's upside could be MVP Aaron Rodgers for all we know.
Yeah, and at one point I was going to make two that stood out to me, and I think you may have touched on it a little bit, but if you look at their other pieces, obviously their wide receiver ones, Jeudy and Watson, are priced basically the same.
Yep.
But then Russ's wide receiver 2 and his tight end 1 are both priced significantly higher than Jordan Love's weapons. So maybe that's an overconfidence on the market's part. Maybe it's a sign that we should be leaning in a little bit more to the Russ side here.
No, it's hard to argue. And really just depends on play scheme going forward too, because, Denver could run the ball a lot more if Javante's healthy. They brought in Pirine, so I just think both offense could be more run heavy too. So, it's tough, especially at this point in the season. We'll know a little bit more once OTAs, we start getting all the hype train stuff coming in. And same thing with when the preseason actually starts, but that's light years away at this point.
Yeah. And on the Jordan Love side, I tried to dig into his college rushing numbers just to get any kind of idea, what he was capable of. The problem is the NCAA counts sacks against your rushing yards. So
right.
I didn't get very far looking into that. Some notes on Green Bay on the whole. They actually ranked 18th in pass rate over expectation in 2022 with Rodgers, so kind of middle of the pack.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess my concern is that the Packers always use a lot of play clock, or at least they did under Rodgers. I think there's a scenario with Jordan Love where you're basically getting Daniel Jones with less rushing upside.
That is incredibly accurate, actually. I didn't think about it that way, but that is nail in the head.
And like you said, there is still the other end of the spectrum where he comes in and like a Mahomes just smashes from learning on the bench, that kind of thing. So both these guys have wide range outcomes. I think Russ's range outcomes are, from anywhere from a top 8 fantasy quarterback to even being benched before we get to week 17. These guys both have huge ranges. So
yeah, I don't see a world where he gets benched simply on his contract, but they brought Stidham, I think that's Jarrett Stidham. Yeah. And he played very well in Vegas towards the end of the year. So, he
would have to really, really be cooked to get benched. But what we saw last year was pretty bad.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Lost a lot of money on them.
But yeah, I think, in terms of my current exposures, I'm pretty even on both of these guys. But yeah, I may be looking to take Russ a little bit more.
Yeah, I think I got a little more Jordan Love, but it is fairly equal as well.
All right, we'll move on here, EJ. I'll let you set this one up for me.
Yeah, so the first one I gave you was Jerick McKinnon, running back for the Kansas City Chiefs. And then from your team, I gave you Jaylen Warren.
Yeah, this is an interesting one for me because particularly with McKinnon and a lot of the drafts I've done to this point were in the puppy. But he was kind of off my board solely for the fact that, for the first couple days or so of the puppy, he wasn't back with the Chiefs. So people were getting him really, really cheap, like 16th to 18th round. And then once he re-signed, he shot back up. So after he shot back up, it's kind of like, well, I don't want to have to compete against teams that have him in the 16th round. But in terms of moving forward, he is 31 years old, and he was a sub 50% snap player most weeks last year. But that's all fine. Like, if you're taking him, you're making the bet that he's going to be the passing down back for Mahomes. Right. And he was really successful in that role last year. He was 10th in yards per route run among running backs, finished 7th in receiving snaps, and then trailed only McCaffrey, Eckler, and Fournette in receiving yards at the position, which sounds really good, but my concerns with him are twofold. First off, compared to some other guys that you're drafting in that range, there's no avenue to him becoming a 3-down back. There's just not. Like, we know his role 100%. And then I guess you also have the concern of, like, last year, the Chiefs wide receivers were genuinely awful. But now you've got Kadarius Toney. Now you've got Rashee Rice. And, yeah, he was part of that terrible receiver trio last year. But maybe Sky Moore takes a step forward. And I think if any of those things happen, now all of a sudden Mahomes is relying on dumping down to the running back a little bit less.
No, I would agree. And I was looking at some of his fantasy stats just from last year. And week 14, 25, 26, about 10, 17 in championship week. But before that, it was pretty much sub 7, 8 every single round. So,
yeah. And I guess that's the other pushback, or I guess my other pushback is, like, he is old. He's 31. Even a couple of years ago, people were calling him dead legs because he couldn't stay on the field. And now he's 2 years older. Even if you're not concerned about the age side of this, I think the Chiefs are going to try to keep him on ice, limit his touches. I guess you could make the argument either way. Like, maybe they save him for later in the year, which would actually be helpful for best ball, but there's just as likely of a scenario where, they're comfortably in the playoffs and they put the brakes on their usage of him to save him for the NFL playoffs.
Definitely.
So on the flip side, Jaylen Warren, he's currently my highest owned player across all drafts. I've got a little bit north of 20% of him. So I'll start with some of the metrics between him and Najee last year. And granted, Najee did have the foot injury, but still some striking numbers here. So 4.9 yards per carry for Warren to Najee's 3.8. He was twice as high in terms of explosive rate compared to Najee, and his PFF rushing grade was around 80 compared to around 60 for Najee. In terms of receiving profile, 1.2 yards per route run to Najee's 0.8. So basically across the board, he was outplaying Najee, injury or not. I guess moving forward this year, The Athletic had an article recently that was hinting at Warren and Harris both being on the field at the same time. I don't buy that for a second. And they even had an article like how frequently Tomlin has done that over the past couple seasons. And it's seriously like less than 10 snaps per season where they have a 2 running back set. So I'm not buying that at all. But I do think if you want to be in on Warren, you probably need to start getting access to him now, because I think the price is going to keep rising. And the reason I'm willing to make the bet on Warren, despite the fact that I don't think he's necessarily like a flex with benefits, a guy like a Gibson or an Eli Mitchell can give you some points while also offering the contingent upside. I think Warren, though, is more of like the premier handcuff this year.
I agree.
Because the fact that the Steelers have Najee actually gives Warren job security. They're not going to be signing a Fournette off the streets or a Zeke, whereas some of these other teams, like, I like Jerome Ford. Jerome Ford's going 4 rounds later than Jaylen Warren, but like, it wouldn't completely surprise me if the Browns signed a Fournette or a Kareem Hunt. Kind of same thing with the Dallas guys. So we know right now that Jaylen Warren is the number 2 in this offense. He showed last year that he can perform as well, if not better, than Najee. And even if we look towards the end of last year, like late in the season, it was a 60-40 snap split between those two. So
that's exactly what I was just looking up.
Yeah. So I think, and even the Chiefs, like obviously they've got Pacheco, McKinnon, and CEH. Like they've brought in guys like a Le'Veon Bell, or LaShawn McCoy before. Wouldn't surprise me if they brought somebody in. So I'm pretty firmly on the Jaylen Warren side in this one.
Yeah, honestly, I have to agree as a whole. I do have my fair share of both these guys, but I think Warren is one guy that we are both. Obviously, you have, but that's your highest share. I don't think it's my highest share. I think once my drafts finish up, he's going to definitely be top 5 for me. I can't say top, but I really do think he'll be top 5 just because he seems like a piece that, and always talking about Najee's health. I mean, Najee did not look good for a long time last year. So, I mean, there's even the chance if Najee regresses in any way, shape, or form that Warren just gets more time because he's been proven in all these efficiency metrics that can be that guy. So I think it's just Warren is very much undervalued at this current moment.
I think the other thing with these two players specifically too is McKinnon's his ADP right now is kind of sitting in a pocket where there's a lot of tight end dart throws. You're also getting into sort of I don't know what tier you call it, but there's a group of wide receivers there, like the Michael Gallup, the Romeo Dobbs, sort of your veteran, but not total dust yet
Right.
guys who like I'm usually tacking on to my teams, even if I start pretty wide receiver heavy. Whereas Warren is going behind that group of wide receivers, at least for the moment. So,
yeah, I think Warren is, and I always use this phrase, but I really think Warren can be a stabilizing piece on down weeks for like if you got a running back that, I don't know, hurts his ankle and he's out for a game, I think Warren can be a guy that would step in and still get you 10 points because he can catch the ball. There's just so many good, like, possibilities for Warren, and at his current ADP, I think it's a steal.
Yep. All right, we'll keep it moving here. We got your next pairing here. Calvin Ridley returning this year for the Jaguars versus our man from the top of the show, DeAndre Hopkins.
Yeah, so I'm going to make this point for both of them. So one thing we know about elite receivers in recent years is that when they go somewhere else, they are still elite. Calvin Ridley, we'll just touch on the people that have done it. A.J. Brown, Tyreek Hill, DeAndre Hopkins, Devontae Adams. I'm sure there's somebody that's not coming to my brain off the top, but that's 4 people that we've highly regarded fantasy wide receivers, and they're continuing to grow. Calvin Ridley, DeAndre Hopkins already done it once. Calvin Ridley's first 3 seasons, 26, 18, 4. Then he started that 4th game with double-digit points in all 5 games and had 8+ targets in each of those games. Part of Calvin Ridley for me, and I use this term very, very intentionally, if you're betting on Ridley, you're betting on T-Law to take a step forward. I think Trevor Lawrence is truthfully going to be that Joe Burrow breakout year. So I think essentially, if you want to get Joe Burrow a couple picks later than what you want, you could get T-Law if you want to go that route with the game stack. So I'm betting on T-Law in this sense, and I think Ridley is going to take a massive step forward with that. Last year, we saw Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram, even Zay Jones at times have super, super great games. So he's proven to be able to spread out the ball, get points all over the board. And I think Calvin Ridley will be the primary absorber of all those points. Like I said, he's had time to spend with the team. He came back in the middle of the year last year. Obviously, he couldn't play with them, but he could spend time, learn the playbook, all the kind of basic stuff. He's not coming off any injury, so he should be more healthy than ever before. And there's just a lot of excitement with that. And I still think he has that big play potential. There was a report that came out the other day that was saying that he moves different than everybody on the field. Now, what that means could be anything in the world, but He's moving different, whether that's better or worse. I'm assuming that's a good thing. I don't think they would have spread that kind of news if it wasn't. Moving on to DeAndre Hopkins here. So I just pulled up the current betting odds on where he lands, and that obviously alters a whole lot of whether I rather go Calvin Ridley or DeAndre Hopkins. Currently, the Bills are plus 125, so they're very much the favorites. Chiefs plus 300. Cleveland has made a big move. This is all from DraftKings Sportsbook. Cleveland's plus 550, Baltimore 700, and Dallas 1,300. So let's just say he lands on the Bills because that's the betting odds for this right now. So he's the wide receiver 2 there. And like I said before, he's kind of very much touching that T. Higgins role in my eyes. I think we definitely got to knock Diggs down some. I don't think we can't compare Diggs and Jamar Chase because they're different receivers. The upside for Diggs is lower in my eyes than what Jamar Chase is. So I guess if I'm honestly looking at it, I guess we would phrase DeAndre Hopkins maybe a little bit above T. Higgins, solely for the fact that I think these guys are going to pass for about the same amount of yards. Joe Burrow, potentially a little bit more, just because he's more of a pocket passer. So I think we got to rank Hopkins a little bit above there. So if we're to put that terms in the ADP, I think we can very, very much lean on DeAndre Hopkins as being a higher and better pick in the long run. And it's hard for me to say that because I've been a Calvin Ridley truther from the very, very beginning. And I just think that DeAndre Hopkins can step in, have more of that touchdown upside initially, and there's less mouths to feed in the Bills offense.
Yeah, I don't really have a huge take on Ridley. He's kind of been a tough one for me. But like we said at the top of the show, I think DeAndre Hopkins has more room to rise depending on where he lands. So he's my pick right now at ADP. Ridley, to me, like, even if we get into camp and the reports are glowing, like, realistically, how high is he going to rise? Like, I can't really see him getting past the 2-3 turn.
So I would say Calvin Ridley has more, I guess, talent than Christian Kirk, just from a full offensive standpoint of what we've seen over the years.
Yeah.
So where would you be drafting Christian Kirk, do you think, if Ridley wasn't on this team? That's kind of where I would take this and then give Ridley a little bit of boost up. So I think his ADP is just a little bit rich still at this point. And I think DeAndre Hopkins' ADP currently is going to end up turning out to be a little bit higher in the long run. But it's tough because, like, we don't know where he's landing. It's all about the spots. And if he's more of the 2 versus the 1, it worries me if he comes in and he plays like Gabe Davis. Like, that's a lot of players just got burned on Gabe Davis last year, drafting him so high. So I think there's more risk with Hopkins, obviously, in the current situation, but which is kind of weird saying with Calvin Ridley not playing football in nearly 2 years.
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm leaning DeAndre Hopkins currently.
All right. We'll move on to my next one here.
All right. So one of my favorite players all time. Well, I don't know about all time. In the current NFL fantasy landscape, we got Mike Williams and Jerry Jeudy, one of your favorite guys.
Yeah, this was an interesting one for me because going into it, I had a pretty clear take, or at least to this point in drafts, I had made a pretty clear stance on this one. And actually, after going through the numbers, my opinion changed a little bit on these guys. So kind of setting the stage here, obviously these guys go right next to each other in the 4th round. And it's a very flat tier of wide receivers, pretty much all the way from the late 3rd to late 4th. I mean, you can really take your pick, and I won't, if you have a reasonable argument, I won't push back too hard. But, to this point, I'm basically double the field on Mike Williams, about 16-17%, whereas Jeudy, I've only got 7%. So I'll start off with Mike Williams and some of his analytical numbers. So these are from Dwayne McFarland at Fantasy Life. His underlying metrics are that of a backup level target earner. However, he was a borderline wide receiver 1 in terms of air yards, but he was only a wide receiver 3 in terms of PFF receiving grade. So a bit of a mixed bag with his profile. Obviously, we like the air yards for the spike week component in best ball. He had 3 top 10 finishes in the first 7 games last year before getting derailed by injuries. So, that plays into the upside case with him as well. And part of why I've been taking him, I've talked about this on streams before, so I won't belabor the point, but I'm excited to see what the Chargers offense can do now that Joe Lombardi is gone and Justin Herbert is hopefully allowed to throw the ball downfield more.
Yeah, that's a fact.
So I guess kind of looking at Mike Williams in terms of upside case, downside case, the upside case, his ADOT was 12 last year. That's 70th percentile. And a more aggressive Chargers play calling results in more big plays for him, more spike weeks. He still had a good, not great yards per route run last year, so I don't think he's falling off the cliff by any means. The downside case, he was only 24th percentile in ESPN open score. And the team obviously added a first-round wide receiver in Quentin Johnston, who can also be a high ADOT guy. Looking at his games when Keenan Allen was healthy last year, he only had a 17% target share, which is, kind of middle of the pack. It's not what you really want for a 4th-round guy necessarily. He was also targeted in the red zone at a lower rate than Keenan Allen and Austin Eckler. So that's another concern there. And Sean Siegel from RotoViz is certainly one of the more opinionated people out there, but I have good respect for him. And he called Mike Williams the most overpriced player in drafts right now. So while I don't necessarily agree with that, it was enough to make me kind of step back and reconsider my stance on Williams.
Interesting.
So then looking at Jerry Jeudy kind of the same way, his metrics, he's a wide receiver 2 level target earner and a wide receiver 2 level air yards earner. So a little bit more stable profile with him. In games he was healthy last year, he had a 23% target share and a 30% air yard share and a very good yards per out run coming in around 2.2. 3 yards per out run is more of the elite guys, the legendary seasons there. So certainly not bad in that regard. His ADOT was 11.5, which was actually higher than I expected with him. So he can provide the downfield threat there. And even looking at how he played out last year, I don't think we necessarily need to be worried about the is Russ washed argument, because last year when he was healthy in 8 of 12 games, he scored over 10 points. So nice. Even when Russ was atrocious, he produced. And he has a path to more volume or an ADP rise if Sutton gets traded, which I wouldn't necessarily say is likely at this point, but it's at least in the range of outcomes. Mm-hmm. So it's not all upside with him. Obviously, Tim Patrick returns and the team drafted Marvin Mims. I believe that he was an early 3rd-round pick or a late 2nd-round pick, but they spent decent capital on him because they didn't have a lot of draft picks. He was like one of their first draft picks this year. So there is an increase in target competition, but like you made the case with Russ, if we expect this offense to get a little bit better under Sean Payton, I think it could mean a big step forward for Jerry Jeudy. So, right now I am actually favoring Jerry Jeudy, especially since his price is starting to creep up. I kind of want to get back even on him before he goes up too far.
Yeah, and I think so. You basically made the point of it, and way back when we would draft Mike Williams as a spike week kind of guy, plain and simple. And I think that's kind of more or less what we're falling back towards, especially when with the Chargers drafting Quentin Johnston too. Honestly, I think they're going to have a lot more 3 wide receiver sets with a more talented receiver, at least from the eyeball test. And same thing with Jerry Jeudy. We know he's the clear one on the team, no matter what, going forward. And Russ apparently loves him, so he's going to target him. He's going to get those big and the red zone targets. It seems like everything's just going to go up. And even if Jerry Jeudy kind of like mimics a Michael Thomas of old in a sense before he didn't play for 2 years, I think it would be pretty interesting to see where Jerry Jeudy's upside goes. Do you think there is a true world where Jerry Jeudy could finish top 5 on the year?
Top 5, I think, is probably a stretch. I think he could be a borderline wide receiver 1 if things break right.
Gotcha.
I'm just a little bit concerned about the target volume with all those guys in Denver. Like, that's one thing that does give me pause with him.
So I guess if they still spread the ball out, I don't know. And just in my eyes, I see Jeudy as being like the guy going forward. Because I had Sutton in a lot. I was big on Sutton and not big on Jeudy last year. So I drafted Sutton a lot just in our redraft leagues, even in best ball, all across the board. And Sutton was probably one of almost as much of a letdown as what Russ was as a whole. At least with Jeudy, you had some playable weeks.
Yeah. I did look at Sutton's numbers a little bit, and I guess it's tough because I didn't get the numbers specifically for the games where they overlapped. So this may be a case of one guy being healthy and the other being out, that kind of thing. But Sutton did have similar target share and air yard shares to Jeudy last year. So, and at least
sure didn't feel like
season,
it.
No, it didn't. But like going into the season, we had all the camp reports of like Sutton is Russ's favorite receiver. He's clear number 1. So, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm definitely in the Jeudy camp over Sutton. I just don't want to be too overconfident in that regard.
That's fair. So, yeah, I currently am leading Jeudy, though. I think it's piggybacking off for us. And I don't know. I wasn't big on Herbert last year, and I was I had him in one of my primary leagues, and I got burnt on him. So now it was just like, just double down on it. And I don't know. I'm not super keen on the comeback year.
Fair enough. All right, before we get to our final 2 pairs, I did just want to give a plug. If you're not following the show yet, give us a subscribe here on YouTube. You can also find us over on Twitter. We are going to be giving away $25 when we hit 100 subscribers. So you can get weekly episodes like this from us. We'll also be doing some live stream drafts as we get deeper into the summer, as well as continuing to do Best Ball 15 videos to get you those quick draft recaps. And if Twitter and YouTube aren't your thing, we do have Facebook and Spotify now. So I'll have the link in the description for those.
Moving up in the world.
That's right. Slowly but surely building this thing out. All right, EJ, for your final 2 guys, I gave you Joe Mixon versus Dameon Pierce.
All right, so this one really was hard for me. Mainly for Dameon Pierce was kind of one of my champions for the front of the season last year. And I was really, really big on him just as a whole. I'm like, just have a feeling that this guy's going to turn out. And he sure showed up. So we'll go ahead and just start with Joe Mixon because he's the guy tried and true. We know a whole lot about him. Obviously, he's pending suspension, essentially. He may even get cut. There's a lot of circulating rumors still that if Joe Mixon is going to be a part of this team, and if he's a part of this team, is he starting the year? I think that's one reason why you and me both have a fair share of Chase Brown. I know I probably have more than you, but I've been drafting Chase Brown quite a bit, very, very consistently. But with that being said, Joe Mixon at his ADP right now, if he plays, he's probably one of the better values in best ball. When he's healthy, he's pretty much a low-end RB1 at worst, high-end 2, I guess if you want to say that. And he has overall RB1 potential every single week. 2021, he was the RB3 overall. And as a whole, he doesn't have much backup competition with Pirine gone. Chase Brown, like I said, the only reason I like him so much is because he could be the one in a high-powered offense. Chase Brown is coming off injury, so there's really not a whole lot. All the other backups have been there long enough where if they were going to take a step forward, I think we would have seen it by now. And obviously, he's got the Kansas City game stack at the end of the year, so everybody wants a piece of that. If we find out that Mixon gets everything dropped and he's playing, we know his ADP is going to shoot up. One thing I did find interesting when I was looking over some of just Mixon information is a whole is that he only has about 60% snap share since being the starter. Excluded, I think his first year he had like 40, or maybe it was high 30s, low 40s, but every other year it's been somewhere between like 55 and 64. So he's not a workhorse back by any means. I mean, he's a 2-down back statistically. So that was very, very surprising to me, especially because we seem like he's always getting 20 plus opportunities every single game. So when he's on the field, he's getting the ball, which is plus side. I guess that's what you want. And I know I don't have his efficiency numbers here anymore, but he's never been the most efficient back. It just seems like he scores a lot.
Yeah, that was one thing that I noted on him, was at least last year, specifically in terms of rushing, not necessarily receiving, but he was subpar in the efficiency department last year.
So for Dameon Pierce, my main case for him is Texans are going to run the ball a lot again because you got a rookie quarterback. Seems like that's been a pretty big correlation over the start of years while the rookie quarterbacks work their way into the NFL, kind of learn the game speed, all that kind of stuff. Last year, Dameon Pierce had 20-plus opportunities in 9 of 13 games played. He had double-digit points in all 9 of those games. 2 of those games where he didn't get 20-plus opportunities were the first 2 of the year. You could just say that was the rookie situation. He wasn't playing. So he's going to be a super big stabilizing piece again. And I think that's kind of what you're drafting when you're looking this way. Mixon definitely has more upside, and then Pierce is more the stabilizing guy. He had a few boom games at the beginning of the year. Otherwise, he sat between 11 and 14 points. I do think this offense should be a little bit better. I think they'll get a couple more wins than last year. However, they added Devin Singletary, which with Dameon Pierce being such a low round capital investment for them in the draft, with Devin Singletary being there, we've seen, if you ever look at Devin Singletary clips, we always talk about this when draft season comes around, and the man is just like, how is this guy not an elite running back?
I know, it's amazing how good he looks when you're just watching a clip.
Yeah, it is just, it's shocking. So I do think the team, like I said, I think they're going to run the ball enough where Pierce still gets quite a few opportunities. If he's maintaining that 20-plus opportunities, that's a running back you want to take. So I'm hoping he sits around that, like I said, 11 to 14 points per game, because that can be your RB2 every single week. You get that, you can't really ask for much more. If you get booms from other guys and he ends up in your flex, that's okay too. So he ended up averaging 11.6 overall in the year. Mixon's only season under that was his rookie year. Pierce was a rookie. And then we all know the Bengals were very, very, very bad until Joe Burrow came in. So it's really kind of a coin toss here. Because if you end up missing out on Mixon for the first couple games, I think I personally rather have Dameon Pierce. And it's hard for me to say that knowing that Mixon has the high-end upside. But where you're drafting him, he's potentially your RB2. And if you're missing out on the front part of those games, Mixon's a little bit scary for me. So I'm probably going to end up drafting a little bit more Dameon Pierce since they're going right next to each other, essentially.
Interesting. I think you laid out the Mixon case really well. One note I had, Burrow has been elite at passing to the running backs, even back to his time at LSU. I mean, he made Clyde Edwards-Helaire look like a first-round pick. So, but I guess for me, I'm on the Mixon side here solely because it's the same thing as the DeAndre Hopkins argument of like, because he is a subpar rusher in terms of efficiency, I'd rather take my shares now than if we find out he is going to play 17 games. I mean, he was a 1-2 turn pick last year. So like if we knew he was playing 17 games, I think the market would have him like mid-third round.
Definitely.
Whereas Pierce, like I just don't see a path to him rising that much. No. So I think you can wait on him until later in the summer. And, worst case, he rises to like a mid-fifth round pick. That's not going to be cost prohibitive to taking him.
No, that's hard to argue. That's really hard to argue. I just see, and circling back to my love and savior of JMO potentially missing the first 6 games. Mixon might miss the first 6 games. So I really should be more in on Mixon at this draft capital. But I feel like I don't mind it as much because I have 8 wide receivers on the team. I feel pretty comfortable that those 7 can supplement. Whereas when I'm going running back, most of the time I'm looking at 5, occasionally 6, depending how. And I don't want to feel forced into going 6 running back, knowing because I went wide receiver early and then I took Mixon and now and obviously this all depends on team schemes. But you do make a very good point that if Mixon plays all 17, and like I said, I laid the point that he's definitely the best value in the whole entire best ball landscape right now.
Yeah, I think if you're taking Mixon, you have to lean into the fact that he's not going to get suspended. So like you could build a team where you just rip wide receivers early, take Mixon in the late 5th and treat him like he's going to be, a borderline RB1. Mm-hmm. Don't worry about the suspension. Still draft, your 5 running backs like you would if you had a Jonathan Taylor. And then now you've potentially got a team with a top-notch running back, but with 4 rounds of value saved. Like that's how I would be playing it here instead of like – basically, I'm willing to take on the risk that those teams are just dead if Mixon gets suspended.
And here's the thing we can think about, too, is because Kamara had his whole thing last year, and that got pushed back to this year. And we haven't even heard about that yet this year. So, I mean, there's a lot of argument that, Kamara, probably, barring his production, was not there. If Joe Mixon has that whole pushback into the next year, it's definitely not out of the range of outcomes that happens and he ends up being the guy again and sits around that RB1, low end RB1, RB2, like guaranteed every single week.
Yeah. And it's so hard for our brains to like ignore the suspension risk because it's right there in front of us. Like, oh, this guy could miss 4 games, but there's so many guys who we're drafting right now who are going to get hurt and miss a couple weeks here and there, a month here. Like you're going to have to run pure in terms of injuries, in terms of suspensions. So yeah, I guess just when you are drafting, like you just got to lean into the fact that your guys are going to play.
Yeah. I think part of it for me too comes, like I said, I got that a little bit of emotional bond with Pierce and it's hard not to stay on your guys and that you've fell in love with. And I think that's something that every fantasy player needs to remind of. This year is a new year. Just because what happened last year doesn't mean it's going to be this year.
Yeah. All right. Last one here.
All right. So we got Jackson Smith-Njigba for you. And our other guy that we talk a lot about, Dotson. So I just kind of want to set this up where my thought process between these two guys, and I'm sure you'll touch on it. We know the quarterback situation in Seattle, very stable. JSN is looking at the wide receiver 3, possible 2. Jahan Dotson, we know is going to be the 2 in this offense going forward, but we got a new quarterback situation. So I thought these guys should be a lot closer than what they are, and I thought it was very, very interesting. So I really actually wanted to genuinely get your input on what I should be doing in drafts on this.
Yeah, let me pull up my exposures here real quick too, because this was I have the most notes for this one, so I'm gonna run long here. But got 14% JSN and 17% Dotson. So I like both these guys. I've been taking both of them. So I'll start with JSN, and I do have longer notes on him because it is trickier to kind of piece through his situation. So I'll actually start off with the Seahawks as a whole. So looking at their pass rate over expected, last year they ranked 8th, and I excluded 2021 because that was the year that Russ had the finger injury and missed a lot of time. Going back to 2020, though, which granted was Russ, not Geno, but they were 4th in pass rate over expected then. So we think of them as this run-heavy offense, but they actually lean into the pass quite a bit. And I was listening to Fantasy Life podcast, and Chris Allen made the point that pass rate over expected is stickier from year to year when you have coaching staff continuity and key offensive players coming back. So, like, I think we can be confident that they are going to continue to lean into the pass more than sort of what we think when we think, oh, Pete Carroll, he's going to run the ball. But then now shifting gears and getting into their personnel, last year they used 12 personnel, which is 2 tight end sets at the highest rate in the NFL. And they were also top 5 in 12 personnel in 2020. If that's not gross enough, they were the highest rate of 13 personnel, 3 tight ends in 2022 as well. So they use their tight ends a lot, and I think that is part of the concern. The pushback you can make there is, like, look at who they had as wide receiver 3 options. It was Marquise Goodwin and a early career D. Eskridge who couldn't stay healthy enough to be on the field.
Don't forget Freddie Swain.
Freddie Swain, yeah, we've got a bunch of nobodies here. So I think if you are taking JSN, you have to be projecting a little bit that they are going to start to use 3 wide receiver sets a little bit more. So diving in now to JSN specifically, I pulled this from Dane Brugler's scouting reports on The Athletic. He isn't an elite size speed athlete, but he is a crafty route runner with short area quickness and tracking talent to be a sure-handed target. He projects as an early starter who is at his best in the slot. And at Ohio State, he missed most of last year with a hamstring injury, but in 2021, he had a prolific season while going up against guys like Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson for targets. And during that season, he played 90% of his snaps in the slot. So I don't like player comparisons, so this is not meant to be a direct one-to-one, but in terms of how he wins, he strikes me as like an Amon-Ra St. Brown type of player.
Okay.
And I guess kind of thinking through his situation, I think we've had some anchoring with his cost, because if you go back to the big board, the pre-draft best ball contest, most of the analytics folks pretty firmly had him as the wide receiver 1 in this class, and there was a decent gap between him and guys like Addison and QJ. And I think that's part of why he's been stuck up in the 5th round, even though his situation doesn't necessarily set up for it. So I think that's one case you could make, that he should be a little bit cheaper. But, you know, I tried looking into Tyler Lockett to see if there's any signs of a decline with him. And while his EPA per target declined a little bit in 2022, but his red zone target rate was still decent. He still had a strong catch rate over expected each of the last 4 years. I will admit, though, I don't necessarily know how sticky each of those numbers are, so there could just be some noise there. But the point is, I didn't see any clear indications that Lockett was declining year over year. So I guess my takeaway is that on the surface, his mid-5th round price, and I guess now he's closer to the 5-6 turn, but either way, his price does seem a tad steep, but it's a gross range for wide receivers in the 5th. Like, the 5th round as a whole is pretty gross once you get, you know, Drake London and Terry McLaurin go at the 4 or 5 turn, and then it's like you can take an elite tight end if you want, and once those guys are off, it basically feels flat from the mid-5th to the late 6th. So I think that's part of why he hasn't gone down all that much. Ultimately, I think he has multiple outs, and he has the talent profile that we want to bet on. So what I mean by he has multiple outs, he could get targets by taking them from the tight ends. I think Fant and Will Dissly combined for about 100 targets last year. He could take targets from either Lockett or Metcalf. And then you also have, you know, the contingent value, you know, whether it be Lockett declining or an injury to Lockett or Metcalf. So ultimately, Seattle, I know we've talked about, is an offense that we like for this year. I want to keep taking shots on them. I'll talk more about Dotson in a second, but I actually came out of this with a slight edge towards JSN. So curious what you think about kind of that, the way I laid that out there.
Yeah, no, I honestly, I like a lot of the points you made, and I'm definitely, It's hard for me to switch because I've always been on Dotson because of where his ADP is at solely at that point right now. And it's hard for me to bet on a rookie receiver that early when like I still like Chris Godwin and Mike Evans in that range. I'm not necessarily saying Baker is going to be the end all be all for him, but I still think Baker will be able to prove well enough for those guys to still have numbers. So I don't really have a lot of JSN, and I think I will draft him more going forward, given your reasons. But I just haven't. I don't know. It's one of those things where the path is so blurry still that it's scary for me seeing Dotson, knowing the path for Dotson is already there.
Yeah. And I think, we talked about how I think you should play it when you draft Mixon. I think when you're taking JSN, you need to take him with the understanding of like, it may be a slow start for the first 4, 5, 6 weeks. But I think by the time we get late in the season, the path is there for him to start producing.
So this is kind of off this topic. Do you see it's similar just because it's related to Seattle? Do you think that's going to happen also with the running back situation? And do you think that as a whole, just the 2 rookies drafted this year are going to end up taking over for, I don't know if you want to consider Ken Walker a veteran at this point, but taking more of eating up their time?
Yeah, the running back one is one where I'm willing to take both guys at cost, not necessarily in the same draft, although I don't think it's a terrible idea if you get them at a value. But I just think like Ken Walker showed and Ken Walker didn't even get the receiving work, but like he showed what a talented back can do in this offense. And I think both he and Charbonnet are talented. So it's like I'll keep taking bets on both of them. I guess I don't have a strong opinion on Charbonnet necessarily overtaking Walker, but we see it year over year. These rookies, both running back and wide receiver, you start to see the production spike towards the end of the year.
So, right.
Like I'm willing to make that bet with both of these guys as well.
Okay. Yeah, because Dotson missed quite a bit of time last year, but when he did play, he shined from what I remember. I think majority of his games, he was double digits. I don't remember. I looked at the stats before. This was a couple days back. But yeah, I thought these guys were super comparable in a lot of ways. And I think I really do think they're going to probably come out finishing around the same points. Like you said, maybe Dotson will be more front heavy and JSN will be more back heavy. So that's just also something to consider when you're building your teams and your drafts.
Yeah. I think the hard thing that I have with JSN is like somebody with his type of profile and play style is going to need, probably close to 100 or more than 100 targets to really have a monster season. Mm-hmm. And I don't necessarily think you're getting that. So if you are taking him, it's specifically for that late season stuff. I think that's where you got to be making the bet, because by that point he could be on the 100 target pace. I just don't necessarily think it's going to be there for the whole season.
Sure.
But yeah, so shifting gears to Dotson, you kind of mentioned he did run pretty hot last year. His target share though was just average, around 18%. And he scored 7 touchdowns, while his expected touchdown based on his targets and all that was closer to 4. So nice. He ran a little bit pure in the touchdown department, which sometimes that sticks from year to year, but it's not necessarily something I want to bet on. Obviously, you can see here his price has started to increase. I know it says it's only gone up 1 there, but it feels like he's been going up more than that. So I would not be surprised if, when you look in another week or two, that he's up even higher than that. The QB uncertainty is worrisome. Also, you have the new offensive coordinator there, which granted we think is an upgrade, but that's another avenue to some uncertainty with him. One red flag for me with Dotson was his 1.4 yards per route run last year was among the lowest of the several last years of rookie wide receivers. But, I was listening to Matt Harmon, Reception Perception. He noted that yards per route run is impacted by quarterback play. So that's another thing to think through there. I'll just add that Terry McLaurin was closer to 2.0. So we can't completely be like, oh, it's just the quarterbacks.
No.
And I guess that's ultimately where I come down on Dotson is like, I think McLaurin is good. Like, I still think McLaurin is the one. I like drafting Dotson, but I'm not drafting him as if he's going to, break out and become the wide receiver one in this offense. So a couple other scouting report things on him. If you're curious, he's not necessarily a tackle breaker, but he has plus speed, hands, and route instincts. Dane Brugler compared him when he was coming out of college to Deontay Johnson, but with better hands. So, and then Reception Perception, Matt Harmon. He finished last year in the 87th percentile versus press man coverage, and he was as good in contested situations and against press man as McLaurin was. So I think in terms of taking a number 2 wide receiver off of a team, I think he's a pretty good bet to be one of the better number 2s, but I don't think the path is there quite yet to be the number 1.
If you knew that Jacoby Brissett was the starter, would you be higher on that? We obviously are predicting Sam Howell to be the starter, but if Jacoby Brissett became the starter, would you be much more in on Dotson?
I don't know if I'd say much more in. I do think it would be a boost just because he's shown to be that he can be a passer at the NFL level. And I think if Howell is playing quarterback, now you're looking at an offense like a Falcons or a Bears where you are going to have the quarterback rushing more. So yeah. I think it would be a boost, but yeah, let me just pull up the ADPs for the wide receivers in general right now. Because I'm curious, like, how high you think Dotson could get.
Probably not a whole lot. Because I'm trying to think, because like I said, we're getting to that point where I mentioned earlier, the Mike Evans 65 borderline of whether we like it or not.
Right. Yeah, he's kind of at the point because now, I mean, he's past Gabe Davis, or he's even with Gabe Davis. That's probably part of the scare of DeAndre Hopkins potentially going to the Bills. But like, you start getting up too much higher, you're looking at Treylon Burks, the Steelers guys, Tony, Marquise Brown, Addison. So I don't know how much higher Dotson can get before I'm in favor of the other guys.
As long as DHop doesn't end up in Kansas City, there's no world ever he gets above Kadarius Toney in my eyes. The Pittsburgh receiver thing still is weird to me that it's so split down the middle when I think there's a clear separation between the two. I think Pickens should be lower, but I could see him go. I mean, so I guess I'm bumping him up 3 spots potentially at the most. He could go around 73, 74.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I actually got into a debate with Chris Spags from Splash Play today, talking through Deontay Johnson and George Pickens. He said 10 out of 10 times he would take Pickens over Deontay Johnson.
Interesting. I think I'd do it 9 out of 10. Or the
opposite. 9 out of 10
the opposite.
Yeah, that's where I land too. And basically we're getting a little bonus this or that here with Pickens versus Deontay Johnson. But my case was like, if you look at the other players who had 140 targets, like they were all third round, or they're all going third round or higher, except for Pittman and Godwin, who are in questionable quarterback situations. And then you've got Deontay Johnson going around later than those guys. So like, Chris Spags was making the point of like Deontay Johnson's efficiency numbers were pretty awful last year, and he's never been great in the efficiency department. He's just a high target earner.
Right.
And it's like, yeah, but the fact that he sucks is already priced in. He's going so much later other guys who are getting 100 targets. So
the price that he sucks is already factored in. elite analysis right there.
right.
But I think it's about time we wrap this one up, don't you say?
Yeah, I think so. So any final thoughts on your end?
No, thank you guys all for watching once again. We're very thankful if you made it to this point. Make sure to comment on who you guys would pick in these situations, and make sure to subscribe if you guys want to see more content. We got some other brainstormed ideas, and we're just hoping to roll them out here sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. Appreciate everybody. And like EJ said, definitely let us know in the comments how you feel on these situations. And we'll be back with another Best Ball in 15 video coming up this weekend. So take care.